I need space. Three small words delivered between the chicken parmesan and tiramisu shattered 20 years of marriage. Robert didn't even look me in the eye when he said them. His gaze stayed fixed on the water glass in front of him, as though the condensation dripping down its side was somehow more deserving of his attention than the woman who had built her life around him. That Tuesday evening at Giovanni's, our favorite restaurant, I sat across from my husband of 2 decades and realized I was being abandoned, not with honesty, not with dignity, but with cowardice, disguised as formality. But if I'm being truthful, the unraveling of my life hadn't begun there in that dimly lit dining room. It had started 3 weeks earlier in a sterile exam room painted in pale mint green, where motivational posters about courage stared down at me like cruel jokes. Stage 2 breast cancer, Dr. Patel had said gently, her eyes kind behind her glasses. The good news is we've caught it early, and with treatment your prognosis is favorable. I nodded like I was listening, like I was present, but I wasn't. The word cancer echoed inside my head like a bell I couldn't unhear. I was 48, and suddenly I was face to face with my own mortality. I drove home from that appointment rehearsing how I'd tell Robert, calmly, rationally, the way he liked things. But when I pulled into our driveway that night, the house was dark. My phone buzzed with a text. Working late. Don't wait up. It was the third time that week. I placed my hand over my chest, where the hidden enemy had taken root, and felt the hollow of loneliness press down. At what point, I wondered, had my husband started pulling away from me? The signs had been there, hadn't they? The new designer suits, the cologne I didn't recognize, the sudden interest in his appearance. The way he flinched when I touched him, the way his eyes darted to his phone during dinners that were fewer and fewer. I had been too busy propping up the illusion of a perfect life to face what was right in front of me. Our home, once a sanctuary, had become a showpiece, and I, the woman who had stood by him through every trial, had become just another accessory. So when he finally said those words at Giovanni's, I think part of me already knew. Still, nothing could have prepared me for how coldly he delivered it. I've changed. You've changed. We want different things now, he said, like he was closing a business deal. And then, with a hesitation that told me everything before his words did, he admitted there was someone else. Jessica. His secretary. It just happened, he said, as though 20 years of marriage could evaporate into a mistake. He slid a business card across the table. His lawyer's. I want a divorce. I looked at that card, then at his manicured hands, at the expensive watch I'd given him for our 15th anniversary, and I asked the only thing I could, is that all? He nodded, relieved I hadn't caused a scene. And I walked out of that restaurant with my dignity intact, even as my heart crumbled inside me. The papers arrived a week later, sterile and cold. 20 years of life together reduced to property lists and division charts. Our house to be sold, retirement split. Even the pearls he had given me on our anniversary were itemized and assigned a price. I should have fought. I should have called a lawyer of my own. But something in me shifted that night at Giovanni's, a quiet, steady calculation. I signed the papers with a hand that barely trembled, and I told myself this wasn't surrender, it was strategy. What Robert didn't know, what I hadn't told him, was that his father, George, had been more of a parent to me than my own father ever was. And George had always seen Robert for what he was, ruthless, selfish, blind to the quiet strength of loyalty. 2 weeks after the divorce, I met George for lunch, and with a sigh that carried the weight of a lifetime, he told me something that changed everything. Years earlier, after his wife's death, George had rewritten his will. Yes, Robert was his only child, set to inherit the family business, the lake house in Vermont, and a substantial estate. But there was a condition. A moral clause, George called it. If Robert ever divorced me without evidence of my infidelity, he would forfeit it all. When George told me this, his eyes never wavered. Because I saw how he treated you, he said. Because too many men in my generation discarded their wives when they thought they'd served their purpose. I wanted to make sure he couldn't. I sat there, stunned, coffee growing cold between us. Robert, in his arrogance, had never even bothered to read his father's will. He had believed walking away from me would give him freedom, a new life, a younger woman, and endless wealth. But in reality, it had set into motion his undoing. That day, something hardened inside me. Not hope exactly, but purpose. For the first time since Giovanni's, I didn't feel like a victim of Robert's choices. I felt like a woman holding a secret that would one day destroy the man who had destroyed me. When Robert moved out, the silence in the house was suffocating. His absence echoed in every creak of the floorboards, every empty space in the closet, every quiet dinner I ate alone at the kitchen counter. But slowly, the silence began to feel less like grief and more like freedom. For the first time in years, I could breathe without tiptoeing around his moods. I didn't have to worry about whether my hair was done to his liking or whether my laugh was too loud at a dinner party. Still, I couldn't erase the gnawing ache of betrayal, the image of him brushing crumbs from the table at Giovanni's as he announced the end of our marriage. Jessica moved into his life with frightening speed. Within weeks, they were photographed at restaurants, her hand looped through his arm, her smile painted wide like she had won some great prize. I avoided the tabloids, but friends sent me clippings as though they thought I needed proof of what I already knew. Each glossy image was another knife, and yet I kept them folded in a drawer not out of masochism but as evidence. Evidence of who he really was. Treatment for my cancer began around the same time. The chemo left me weak, nauseated, stripped of energy. I lost clumps of hair and the shower strands tangled in my fingers, as though parts of me were falling away faster than I could hold them. And while I fought for my life, Robert paraded his new one around town. He never once called to ask how I was. Not once. That was when the grief shifted into something sharper, something that kept me warm when the nights grew unbearably cold rage. George visited often during those months. He would sit with me during treatments, telling me stories about his youth, about the early days of the company he had built from scratch. He confessed regrets, how he had spoiled Robert, how he had ignored the arrogance growing in him. But he also reminded me of my strength. "You are the best thing that ever happened to him," he would say, his voice heavy with conviction. "And the greatest mistake he'll ever make is letting you go." It was George who made sure I knew the details of the will. He handed me a sealed copy one afternoon, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed it into mine. "For when the time comes," he whispered. I understood then that this wasn't just about inheritance. This was about legacy. George wanted to leave behind a message to carve into stone what Robert had failed to learn in life: loyalty matters, love matters, and betrayal has a cost. When George passed away 6 months later, the funeral was a storm of black suits and crocodile tears. Robert stood at the front, Jessica clinging to his arm, playing the role of the grieving son. I sat quietly in the second row, my scarf tied tight over my thinning hair, my heart heavy with loss, but steady with knowledge. I had loved George like a father, and now even in death he was protecting me. The reading of the will was held 2 weeks later in a paneled office that smelled of leather and old books. Robert walked in with his lawyer and Jessica trailing behind, her perfume thick in the air. I could see the smugness in her posture, the way she believed she had stepped into a golden future. Robert barely glanced at me, except for a quick smirk as though I were nothing more than a shadow of his past. The lawyer began, his voice droning through the formalities. Robert leaned back in his chair, waiting for the words he thought would crown him king, sole heir, vast estate, controlling shares. But instead, the lawyer read the clause. The room seemed to stop breathing as the words filled the air. "In the event my son Robert divorces his wife without cause of adultery or abandonment, he shall forfeit all inheritance, and said inheritance shall pass to his daughter-in-law." Silence followed, thick and heavy. Robert's smirk dissolved, his face blanching as though the ground beneath him had crumbled. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tightening around her designer handbag. My heart pounded in my chest, not with guilt or hesitation, but with a cold, hard justice that had been years in the making. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply sat there calm and steady as the lawyer confirmed what Robert had never bothered to understand: his betrayal had cost him everything. Robert's reaction was volcanic. He shot up from his chair, his voice shaking with rage as he barked at the lawyer, demanding to see the documents, demanding to know how his father could do this to him. His lawyer tried to calm him, flipping through the paperwork, but the words were there in black and white, signed and notarized years ago. The will was ironclad. George had seen to that. I watched him unravel his hands, trembling, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Jessica tried to place a soothing hand on his arm, but he shook her off his face, contorting with something between fury and fear. For years he had treated me as though I were disposable, replaceable. And now he was the one being discarded by his own father, by the very legacy he thought was his birthright. The lawyer continued unbothered by Robert's tantrum. He listed the assets, shares in the company, the Vermont lake house, the estate, all of it, every last piece redirected to me. My name echoed through that heavy room like a quiet thunder. And as it did, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph exactly, not joy, but vindication. A sense that the universe, or fate, or perhaps just George's foresight had balanced the scales. Robert collapsed back into his chair, pale and defeated. For the first time in decades, he looked small to me. Not the ambitious man who had once swept me off my feet, not the husband who had promised me forever, but a broken boy, stripped of power, exposed for what he truly was. I should have pitied him, but I didn't. He had made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls and meetings. Lawyers confirmed the transfer of assets. Executives at the company reached out, some with sympathy, some with thinly veiled opportunism. Reporters called, eager to dig into the scandal of the fallen heir and the wife he had discarded. I ignored them all. This wasn't about spectacle for me. It was about closure. Robert, however, didn't stay quiet. He tried to fight the will, of course. He filed appeals, hired new attorneys, even tried to smear me in the press. But George had anticipated this. Every loophole was sealed, every clause fortified. The harder Robert fought, the more desperate he appeared. Jessica, once radiant on his arm, began to fade from the pictures. Within months, she was gone, leaving him to face his ruin alone. One night, months after the reading of the will, Robert showed up at my door. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his arrogance replaced by something almost unrecognizable: desperation. He begged, not for love, not for forgiveness, but for help. He wanted money, a lifeline, a piece of what he thought should have been his. I listened quietly, leaning against the doorway, my arms crossed. For years, I had bent myself into shapes to accommodate him, to make excuses, to keep our world from shattering. But that night, I felt nothing but a calm certainty. "You walked away from me, Robert," I said softly. "And in doing so, you walked away from everything else. That was your choice." I closed the door as he stood there, pounding once, then falling silent. Behind the door, I let out a shaky breath, tears burning in my eyes, not for him, but for the years I had wasted, trying to be enough for a man who could never see my worth. Cancer treatment continued, and with every passing month I grew stronger. My hair began to return, soft tufts sprouting like stubborn proof of resilience. And as I healed, I began to pour my energy into the company George had left me. The same company Robert had assumed would always be his. It wasn't easy stepping into that role. There were whispers, doubts, men who thought I was nothing more than the discarded wife propped up by circumstance. But I knew better. I had been in the shadows long enough, watching, learning, understanding the game. And now finally, it was my turn to play. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I still replay those moments. The restaurant, the will, the look on Robert's face when he realized what he had lost. The hurt lingers like an old scar that aches when the weather changes. But it doesn't define me anymore. What defines me is survival. What defines me is the knowledge that I walked through fire, betrayal, illness, humiliation, and I came out not just whole but stronger. Robert thought he was trading me in for a younger version of happiness. What he didn't realize was that in discarding me, he was discarding everything his life had been built upon. His betrayal destroyed him. My endurance saved me. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. But some wounds never close. There are still mornings when I wake and instinctively reach for the other side of the bed, only to find it empty. Even after everything Robert did, after the cruelty, the betrayal, the cowardice, There are remnants of love that linger like stubborn ghosts. 20 years cannot be erased without leaving behind an echo. But those echoes no longer haunt me, they remind me of the woman I once was, and the woman I have become. Stepping into the role George left me was not without struggle. The boardroom was filled with men who looked at me as though I were temporary a placeholder until Robert found a way back in. They underestimated me the same way Robert always had. And like Robert, they were wrong. I spent months combing through reports, restructuring departments, rooting out the quiet corruption that had been allowed to fester under Robert's watch. Slowly, the tide shifted. Employees who had once whispered behind my back began to come to me for guidance. Numbers that had been stagnant began to climb. The company was healing just as I was. Robert's life, meanwhile, spiraled further into ruin. His legal battles drained what little savings he had. Jessica left him for good, moving on to someone with deeper pockets and fewer scars. I heard through acquaintances that he'd been forced to sell the penthouse he'd once flaunted, and was now renting a modest condo on the edge of the city. The man who once towered over me with arrogance was now a shell stripped of wealth, stripped of legacy, stripped of pride. And yet when I think of him, I don't feel the satisfaction I once thought I would. Revenge, as intoxicating as it feels in the moment, doesn't fill the empty spaces inside you. It doesn't mend the cracks betrayal leaves. What it does is clear the ground, so you can rebuild on your own terms. That is what George gave me the chance, not just to survive, but to begin again. I began to travel, something Robert had always discouraged. I stood on the cliffs of Ireland and let the wind whip through my hair, free and alive. I walked the streets of Paris at night, the lights shimmering off the Seine, and I felt whole in a way I hadn't in decades. I even went back to Giovanni's one evening, the restaurant where Robert had ended our marriage with such cold indifference. I sat at a table alone, ordered the same chicken parmesan, and ate every bite with quiet triumph. It was no longer the place where my world collapsed. It was just a restaurant, and I had reclaimed it. The greatest twist of all, I think, is that Robert destroyed himself. He thought leaving me would give him freedom, happiness, power. Instead, his betrayal set in motion the very clause his father had written to protect me. George knew his son better than I ever did. And in the end, it was not my revenge that ruined Robert. It was his own arrogance, his blindness, his inability to value what truly mattered. I am 50 now. The cancer is in remission. My hair has grown back in silver streaks I wear proudly. I no longer measure my worth by the reflection in Robert's eyes, but by the strength I see when I look in the mirror. I am not the woman who walked into Giovanni's trembling. I am not the woman who signed divorce papers with a breaking heart. I am not the woman who lay awake at night wondering why I wasn't enough. I am more. And if you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever been discarded by someone who promised to love you, I want you to hear me clearly. You are more too. You may not inherit an empire, you may not watch karma strike so cleanly, but you will survive. And in surviving, you will rebuild. And in rebuilding, you will rise stronger than you ever thought possible. So if my story touched something inside you, if it made you remember your own scars and your own strength, I ask you to like this video, share it with someone who needs courage, and subscribe for more stories like mine. And please leave a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me how you endured. Tell me how you rose. Because together in our honesty and our survival, we remind the world that betrayal may wound us, but it will never define us.